Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we'll continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. One fine summer day, Miss Reed found an old man walking along the road who asked to stop in her garden, and she granted that and brought him lemonade and some cookies, and began to learn his life story. His name was Alf, and through a combination of his wife's death and the breakdown of his own health, he had been forced to go live with his daughter. He knew as soon as he crossed the threshold that it would never work. There was something about the angular light wood hat stand in the hall and the overpowering aroma of floor polish that met him, which seemed to epitomize the unwelcoming quality of Ursula's abode. He had been allotted the front room, a bleak north-facing apartment sparsely furnished. An iron bedstead with a thin mattress and frosty white counterpane took up the space by the window. The lino, printed to look like parquet blocks, shone like a mirror. A skimpy rug slid about the polished surface whenever anyone was rash enough to step on it. A small one-bar electric fire did its best to cast a little warmth into the room, but failed miserably. Alf's two grandchildren came into the room to greet him. They were an unprepossessing pair. Sandra was a lumpy, sandy-haired 8-year-old, and Roger a skinny, rabbit-toothed boy of 11. Both had adenoids and breathed habitually through their mouths. As they ate almost without cessation, the spectacle of his grandchildren did not encourage Alf's affection for them. Their father was a lorry driver, a man of few words but enormous appetite. It seemed to Alf in the months that followed that Ursula spent most of her time peeling great saucepans full of potatoes to assuage his hunger. He did not see much of his son-in-law as he worked long hours, and Alf regretted this. It would have been nice to have a man to talk to now and again. With every week that passed, Alf realized with increasing despair how bitter it is not to have a home of one's own. He did his best to remain equable. Indeed, with his unquenchable Cockney spirit, cheerfulness kept breaking in, whether he would or no. Ursula resented this. She would have liked to see a proper humility, an appreciation of all her hard work. The gay quip, the sardonic aside, any sort of ironic levity, beloved of Alf, smacked of insurrection to Ursula. It was obvious that the old man would rebel one day, and before long things came to a boil between Ursula and her father. The row began, as might be expected, over the children. It was a hot May day, so hot, in fact, that for once Alf was grateful for his cold room. He sat reading a letter which had come from Weymouth that morning, and looking forward to his tea when the children returned from school. Dusty wrote as affectionately as ever. He knew well enough that his old friend was unhappy, although he had not said so in black and white. "Don't forget what I've said before," wrote Dusty, "that you are welcome here any time you like to come." Alf found great comfort in that sentence. He read it several times before returning the letter to its envelope on the table, and then settled back for a doze. Before long he awoke. The two children were in the room, the boy gazing out of the window, and Sandra— Alf's anger rose as his senses returned— Sandra was reading Dusty's letter. He struggled to his feet and made towards the table. "Don't you dare meddle with my things," stormed the old man. The child looked sideways at him and contorted her face by the lift of one nostril into a contemptuous sneer. Just so, many years before, Ursula had looked at him and received a sound box on the ear. Without thinking further, Alf repeated the process and had one moment of unalloyed pleasure as his palm clouted the sandy head. The piercing shrieks that followed brought Ursula hurrying from the kitchen. "He hit me, Mom! I wasn't doing nothing, Mom! He just hit me!" Ursula's face and neck grew red with wrath. "You keep your hands to yourself," she yelled. "I can remember your bullying ways when I was her age. Don't you think you can knock my kids about the way you knocked us?" "She was reading my letter," began Alf, but was brushed aside. "As though it's not bad enough having you here all the time, burning the fire and the lights, eating us out of house and home. I pay my own way." Ursula gave a derisive snort. "Pay your way?" she echoed. "How far do you reckon your bit of pension goes these days?" Sandra, seeing attention slipping from her, set up a further bout of sniveling. "Mom, I believe I got mastoid, I really do. My ear hurts something awful where he hit me." Ursula threw an arm protectively around her daughter. "We'll take you down to the hospital after tea." She rounded again on the old man. "And if she's got a broken eardrum and is deaf for the rest of her days, she'll have you to thank. The ingratitude! That's what gets me, the ingratitude! Here I am, slaving day in, day out, with never a word of thanks for my trouble, and how am I repaid?" "Stop playing actin'," began Alf. "Play actin'!" screamed Ursula. "Don't you dare insult me after all the harm you've done. I've just about had enough of you and your ways." She flung out of the room, dragging Sandra with her. The boy, who'd watched the proceedings with sly enjoyment, slid after them. At the door he turned, poked out an impudent tongue, and vanished. Alf was left alone. He was more shaken than he cared to admit. He shouldn't have hit the girl, he told himself. He was enveloped in a hot wave of guilt and shame. It receded, leaving him shivering with shock. God, what a hole, he thought, looking round the room, to think of spending the rest of his days in this place with the added misery of Ursula and the children. His eye fell upon Dusty's letter. In all that bleak room it was the only spot of comfort. Why should he stay? Why should he endure the humiliation of living with Ursula? He had his pension. He had a true old friend, a friend, moreover, who offered him a real home. With growing purpose, he went to his bed, reached beneath it for his battered suitcase, and set it open upon the white counterpane. Methodically, with the exactitude of an old soldier, he began to pack his possessions. He was off. "That was Thursday," said the old man, reaching for his glass. He sounded bemused. "And now it's Saturday. Seems a lifetime ago, miss, a lifetime." He gazed into the distance toward the towering downs, but I guessed that he was looking beyond them to the life that he had left behind in Northampton. He looked very old, very vulnerable, to be alone and with no home. I felt uneasy. "And your daughter?" I inquired. "You told her where you were going?" I could imagine the remorse which might well be gnawing at any woman in her position, despite the portrait of flinty-hearted indifference the old man had drawn of her. "Left a note," said the stranger perfunctorily. "Just told her I'd had an invitation from Dusty, and this seemed a good time to go down there." "So she'll expect you back sometime?" I said. It was a relief to know that he had not burnt his boats completely. "Never!" he shouted, sitting bolt upright. "Not as she begged and prayed of me. I've had more than I can take there. Never again." He scrambled to his feet, still looking belligerent. His gaze flickered over the sunny garden as though he saw it for the first time, and he turned to look directly at me. The anger faded into a smile. "You been good to me, miss, letting me run on like I have. I must be getting along." He fished inside his jacket and brought out a small creased map. He unfolded it carefully, and I noticed that his fingers shook. Across its grubby surface a thick ruled line ran from Northampton to Weymouth. "There's my route," he said proudly, holding up the map. "Always like a bit of map work ever since my army days. I'm a bit off true here, but no matter. Reckon if I make for Salisbury Plain I shan't be far off." He stuffed the map back in his pocket and began to hoist the case across his shoulders again. "You're not walking all the way?" I asked anxiously. "Not me," he said. "I've hitchhiked most of it so far, but took a fancy to have a walk this morning. Haven't seen the country on a sunny day, not to notice it, I mean, ever since Jessie died. Brought her back to me somehow, being alone and peaceful out in the fresh air." "Make for Caxley," I said, "but wait here a minute." I returned to the house and looked in my purse. As usual, it was remarkably light, but there was a pound note. Why, I wondered, was it always the end of the month when such emergencies arose? I hastened out again and pressed it upon him. "No, miss," he protested. "I got a bit by, you know." "If you don't get a lift, go by train," I urged him. "You don't want to arrive absolutely knocked up." He pocketed the note, and we walked together to the gate. He was smiling now, as though at some pleasurable secret. "Can't wait to see old Dusty's face when I turn up," he said over the gate. "You haven't told them?" I asked, my heart sinking. "Why should I?" he replied reasonably. "I know old Dusty means it when he says I can go any time." His tone was warm and affectionate. His wrinkled old face glowed at the thought of the welcome ahead. He straightened himself up and gave me a smart salute. "Thanks for everything, miss, bless you. Think of me paddling in a day or two." Within 2 minutes I watched the little figure disappear round the bend of the lane. Despite the sunshine, I shivered, for I could not help thinking of the woman that Dusty should never have married, the stringy one with the sharp nose who was white and spiteful. Poor Alf, I mourned. Poor Alf. Yes, some of our Fairacre visitors are lively birds. The gypsies in their clashing colors look as exotic and gay as any parrot from the East. But I remember Alf as a wren, perky and completely English, but somehow infinitely pathetic in his smallness. I think of him often, the stranger who called but once. Will he ever return? I can't be certain, but I have a feeling that Alf was on his last flight that summer day. Chapter 11. The Old Man of the Sea. "It's my belief," announced Mrs. Pringle as she bailed boiling water from the electric copper into the washing-up bowl, "that they overate themselves." "I thought they were rather more abstemious than usual," I replied. "Usually they start eating as we reach the end of the lane and continue until we get to Beresford." "Shameful!" ejaculated Mrs. Pringle, flinging a trayful of sticky cutlery into the water. The noise was deafening. "Then it's a quick dash into the sea, out again, and time for a solid lunch. This time they didn't appear to eat so much on the journey, unless I'm getting used to it," I added. We were trying to probe the mystery of the many absences from school on this particular Monday morning. Almost a third of the desks were empty, and I suspected that general inertia was the common complaint after a long day at the sea on Saturday. Mrs. Pringle argued for gluttony alone, but I have never found Fairacre children suffering from delicate digestions. Their appetites, quickened by the winds which sweep the downs, are enormous, and their digestive tracts are quite accustomed to coping with a steady supply of ices, sweets, fruit, fizzy drinks, as well as 4 hefty meals a day. "Could be typhus, I suppose," said Mrs. Pringle chattily. "There was a bit on the telly about typhus from the sewage going into the sea. Fair gives you the creeps. I said to Pringle, the way folks live, thank God we've a nice wholesome cesspit." She plunged her hands into the steaming water and withdrew a fistful of dripping dessert spoons lately used for gooseberry pie. "But can't do you no good, say what you will, to go bathing when that sort of thing's going on, as well as dumping this atomic rubbish they don't know what to do with. The sea must be proper unhealthy these days. My heart bleeds for those poor fish, it do indeed." She was now drying the spoons and setting them rapidly in rows. She counted them hissingly, stopped, scrabbled again in the cloudy water, drew blank, and turned to me. Her unlovely face was made even unlovelier by dark suspicion. "'Ere," said Mrs. Pringle truculently, "you been feathering your nest again." This charitable remark referred to an unfortunate incident a few weeks earlier when Mrs. Pringle had come across a school dessert spoon in the kitchen drawer at the schoolhouse. I had not been allowed to forget this lapse. Mrs. Pringle guards the school cutlery, as battered and dingy a collection of plate as one could find anywhere, as if it were the crown jewels. "I find that remark offensive," I said coldly, moving off to ring the school bell. "So's stealin'!" shouted Mrs. Pringle after me above the clatter. With what dignity I could muster, I pulled the school bell rope to summon my depleted pupils to afternoon school. The outing on Saturday had started in brilliant sunshine. By ancient custom, Fairacre's Sunday School and Church Choir combined outing takes place on the first Saturday in July. Evidently, many years ago, the schools in this area used to have a fortnight's holiday at the end of June to enable the children to pick the soft fruit crop. At the end of that time, their wages were paid, and there was money as well as the longing for a jollification. Somehow, the first Saturday in July still remains as the only acceptable day for the annual outing. 2 coachloads set off at 8 o'clock, packed with parents and friends as well as the vociferous children. It was a sparkling morning. Bright drops glittered on the fresh hedges, sunshine glinted on cottage windows, the village pond and the glossy backs of Mr. Roberts' herd of Friesians as they ambled back from being milked. It was most exhilarating. "Won't last," Mr. Willett said morosely, following his wife into the coach. He was dressed in his best blue suit, and his boots shone like jet. No gaudy beachwear for Mr. Willett when he accompanies us to the sea. He is sexton of St. Patrick's, a public figure, and he shows himself to the world as a man worthy of the dignity of his office. He now rammed a small case containing their lunch upon the rack and then bent down to whisper conspiratorially in my ear. "Where's old Misery sittin'?" "Right at the front," I whispered back, knowing at once to whom this referred. "Thanks, miss. I'll make for the back," said Mr. Willett, pulling the case from the rack and departing. I heard him settle with a satisfied sigh as Mrs. Pringle entered, took her place in the front, and intimated to the driver that it was now in order for him to proceed. "Hold hard, Ma," said the driver irreverently. "Just got to check we're all here." He hoisted himself from the wheel and turned round to count us. "All aboard?" he cried at length. "All aboard," we echoed cheerfully, and set off for Beresford. Mr. Willett, as a weather prophet, is usually right, and by the time we had driven through Caxley the sky was overcast and remained so for most of the day. Not that this dimmed the spirits of the Fairacre children. They tore along the famous sands, rushed into the waves, but not too deeply, I noticed, for the sea is not really trusted by us landlubbers, and wielded buckets and spades energetically for most of the exciting day. Their elders enjoyed themselves more sedately, walking along the short pier, scanning the distant horizon through the penny in the slot telescope, and studying the photographs outside the miniature theater at the very end of the pier. It was a pity, we told each other, that we had to set off for home so early, otherwise we could have seen the variety show. 12 acts, and all spectacular. It said so. The air was wonderful, despite the lack of sunshine, tangy and salt upon our faces, and we all had prodigious appetites when we foregathered for high tea at Bunce's, a famous restaurant on the front. The vicar counted heads earnestly. Were we all assembled? Would someone check the numbers with him? Thereupon half the company rose to count the other half, and confusion reigned. Order was eventually restored, but we were, it was agreed, one missing. "Joseph Coggs!" shouted Patrick. "I saw him mucking about under the pier. Shall I run and fetch him?" "I think," said Mr. Partridge, the vicar, in his gentle voice, "we'll wait for 5 minutes, and then send out a search party if he hasn't arrived. No doubt he will be along." At that moment, Joseph wandered through the brown and gold swing doors. He was excessively grubby and looked pale and bewildered. No adult from the Coggs family was present, so I took charge of him. He was remarkably quiet during tea, but ate his way steadily through a plate of ham and salad, 3 iced cakes, a butterscotch sundae, and 2 cups of tea. I was not perturbed by his taciturnity as I watched his eating prowess. He obviously had enough to engross him at the time, and was in any case a somewhat uncommunicative child. Just before 6, we said a sad farewell to lovely Beresford for another year, and mounted the coach. Still, the skies were sullen. At 9, we were back in Fairacre, and at 10 o'clock, I, for one, was in bed. Now, on Monday afternoon, it all seemed a very long time ago. Confronting my depleted class, I mentally rearranged the timetable. The song, which I had proposed to teach them, must wait until the others returned. A spelling test and then some revived memories of Beresford in words and pictures should fill our afternoon very usefully and happily. The spelling test was greeted with groans. Perhaps because they are unbookish children as a whole and do not see the printed word as often as I should like, spelling is a weak point at Fairacre. Even their names, when they are first in my class, at the age of 7 or so, give some of them trouble. And I silently curse the parents who saddle their poor spellers with Penelope, Francesca, or Reginald. Perhaps the worst one is Ronald. It has been my lot for many years to wrestle with Ronlads, Rondels, and even Ronslads, and very exhausting I have found it. This afternoon I bullied them through such necessary exercises as the days of the week. Wednesday, of course, is a stumbling block. The months of the year, all with the possible exceptions of March and June, fearfully hazardous, and a brisk revision of local place names which are invariably written awry. They tottered out to play, quite done up. 10 minutes in the boisterous air of the school playground soon restored them to their usual vivacity, and they settled down to write and draw their impressions of the day at Beresford. I wandered round the busy classroom, admiring their efforts. They were much as I expected. Sandcastles topped with flags, sailing boats, rowing boats, even a steamer, though I am positive no steamers come to Beresford, and unflattering portraits of fellow pupils paddling in zigzag waves. But Joseph Cogg's picture roused my curiosity. Beneath a framework of black crayoned girders stood 2 figures. One, from the blue-striped T-shirt, I recognized as a self-portrait. The other, about half the size, wore scarlet bathing trunks and a crown on his head. A certain amount of scrawling with a blue crayon indicated that water was nearby, and in the distance it looked as though there were a fairy tale palace with the conventional spiky towers. I began to wonder if Joseph was remembering the pantomime rather than the trip to the sea. "Who's this little boy with you?" I asked. "It's a man," said Joseph. "But he's only half your size," I protested. Our art at Fairacre is pretty pedestrian. We make the sun circular, and grown-ups are usually twice the size of children in our portraits. "So he was," persisted Joseph, "but he were a man all the same." I was about to pass on and let him enjoy his fantasy when he pointed out 1 or 2 other features. "This here's the pier, see? I met this man under there. He was only up to my shoulder." "Sounds likely, don't it?" scoffed Ernest, who had come up to see the picture and was rapidly joined by half a dozen others who felt like stretching their legs. "Bet you dreamt it, Joe," said John. Joseph's dusky face grew red with anger. His dark eyes smoldered. "He were a man," he repeated mulishly. "He told me. He said he was the old man of the sea, and he lived in a palace. That's it there." He thrust a black forefinger upon the spiky towers. There was a burst of derisive laughter from the onlookers, which I hastily quelled. Joseph was very near to tears, and I was not going to see him taunted, inexplicable though his garbled story sounded. 10 minutes to finish," I announced, "and we'll have a quiet 10 minutes, please. I'm looking for someone sensible to help me clear up at home time." This, as usual, worked like magic, and peace descended while they finished their scribbling. Partly to keep Joseph from being teased on the way home, and partly because I was intrigued by what lay behind his account of the stranger, I chose him to remain behind after school. The rest of the children ran off, their voices dying away in the distance. The classroom seemed unnaturally quiet. We could hear the birds cheeping on the guttering and the whispering of the leaves outside the Gothic window. Joseph stacked the papers carefully. His own, I noticed, was placed lovingly on top. He brought them to my desk, put them down, and remained gazing at me. "I ain't lying," he said abruptly. "I know you're not," I answered. There was silence for a moment, a silence which I did not intend to break first. "I really did see him under the pier," said Joseph slowly. "That's why I was late for tea. That's why—" He faltered, took a deep breath, and began again. In bits and pieces, fits and starts, the astonishing story came out. To an adult, it was both pathetic and comic. To a small boy, it was quite apparent the encounter had been terrifying and miraculous. And we'll hear about Joseph's encounter with the Old Man of the Sea next time.